Hey friends, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well and welcome back to another episode of the 50 Most Relevant, talking Luke Davies-Uniacke. Is he the premium midfielder that's about to send himself to the moon? Or is that body going to continue to let him down in 2024 and he becomes another maybe 25 will be his year? We're going to talk all things LDU and his relevance in SuperCoach, Dream Team, and AFL Fantasy. Joining me on this episode, a man that if you're on Twitter, you've probably seen the FantasyNut roll around through, but he's making his Coaches Panel debut, and you're going to hear him plenty throughout the 2024 preseason and season proper. Vams, nice to chat. And man, LDU is a fascinating guy to consider in 2024.
Yeah, great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a player who I think is going to be super relevant this year. And I might even say, I think should be a little bit higher on your list, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some great conversations we can have about LDU. Let's break through his season that has just been. An average of 113.6 means he's priced at just over $635,000 in SuperCoach. 10 tons last year, one of them a seasonal and career high score of 155. While in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, a seasonal average of 97.4 means he's priced at literally about $800 short of 900K in DT and 879,000 in AFL Fantasy. 7 tons last year, 138 was his top score and a career high of 145. Last year, ranked 4th in the league for stoppages per game, 13th for contested possessions, 14th for effective disposals, top 10 for clearances, top 20 for disposals, and even top 20 for handballs and inside 50s per game. Even without just looking at the fantasy stats, Vams, this guy just knows how to get it done. Such a great turn of speed, such a strong clearance winner. And the good news is he's not just a one-dimensional inside bull. He's such a damaging midfielder and a joy to watch.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head and why he's so tempting. And indeed, he was a very, very popular choice even going into last year. And many actually predicted last year was the year we'd see him sort of break out into that premium, perhaps even uber premium range. However, as we'll get into, that didn't quite come to fruition. But as you said, it's the fact that he's got such a well-rounded fantasy game, both in terms of what I would describe as sort of the holy trinity of what you want to see in a fantasy mid, that being those with high time on ground, high CBAs, and preferably high sort of points per minute as well. And he's got all of that. His time on ground is typically around that 85% mark, which is very, very high. He had a couple of games this year where that was much lower due to some injury-affected games where it brought down his overall average, but more often than not, he's in that 85% sort of range in terms of time on ground. His CBAs, they're as high as it really gets in AF. So, last year, his CBAs really hovered between that 80 to 85% for most of the season. And, obviously there's going to be points in the game where you're not on the ground. So basically when he's on the ground, if there's a CBA, he's in there. And then you look at that third thing, which is that points per minute. And ideally you want it to go above that 1 range. If you're really sort of at the top end, you're at that 1.1 range. He's just a tick below that at the moment, about 0.97. But there's actually not that many mids that go at 80% CBAs, 80% time on ground, and have that 1 point per minute sort of scoring average. Last year, there was only about 5 of them, them being sort of Bontempelli, Parrish, Oliver, Sarong, and Green. And just about all of them, perhaps Parrish is not quite there yet, although he's shown to be there in the past. They're all those sort of 110 type midfielders. And I think what makes Luke Davies-Uniacke so tempting is that, again, he's got all those factors going in his favour, but there's a couple of things that are bringing him down, which we'll get into. But again, that well-rounded game. What do we mean by that? A player that doesn't rely on just a big bag of goals or a high mark game or 10 tackles, but indeed he's got high possessions that he can get. He can push that 30 possessions in any given game. He's also got that 4-5 marks a game and around that 4-5 tackles a game, which means if he is sort of clamped down on the inside, he can get you those 10 tackle games, or if he's getting a tag perhaps on the outside, again, those tackles can push him up. Or not getting the tackles, he's got these games where he's put together 6, 7 marks as well. So ideally, you want to have these guys that when you combine their tackle numbers and their mark numbers, ideally, if they can get to that 9-10 range, that's a great marker of a player that can potentially push that 110 plus mark. And last year was 8.2, but you compare that to some other sort of top dog mids. You got sort of Oliver about 10.9. Dawson was really top of the tree last year, about 11.7. But then you've got guys like Merritt, Taranto, Goulden, Brayshaw. They're all around that 10 mark. And LDU's not too far away from that.
And I think that's the real encouraging for us is we're looking at who are these right premium midfielders to start in our team. And what you're really alluding to there, Vams, is he's in so many different key indicators. He's already there. Probably the biggest concern people have is the games played tally, at least for last year, and a back kind of start of his career have been a bit inconsistent, but still from the 14 games he played last year, he averaged a 97.7 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. There's a bunch of tons, 7 there, 4 of them over 120. So ceiling's not his concern. And even in the last 6, he goes at over 110. It's a 112.1 average, ranked 27th for mids in the format of AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. So we're seeing in so many areas, he's just that half step away from being able to be that top line premium midfielder we want and need. Arguably, he's already there in SuperCoach if it wasn't for missing so many games. He's ranked 11th for averages of midfielders based off what he did in 2023. That average of 113.6 means he's coming into the season with a better average than Errol Goulden, Tom Green, Caleb Sarong, the Brownlow medalist Lachie Neale, and Andrew Brayshaw. So he's already up at that top end right now with 7 scores of 120 plus last year, multiple 140s, and his last 6, he went at 126.6. So he's showing for patches and stretches of his career, especially really over these last 3 years. We've got a guy who's got the potential that is not just hypothetical, but proven over big stretches of time that he could be one of the best midfielders going around for us. And Vams, I'm curious about this. You made these little notes of stats and points. It feels like to me that when we talk about value at the start of the year, we almost go completely to the bottom range of cash cows, or we find ourselves looking at mid prices and breakouts. But certainly in AF and DT, where there's a little bit of value based on what his current average is versus what the forecast scoring could be. How important is it to look at these players that are in this range that you still go, look, they're around that 100 price point, but I feel like they could make it to the next tier level and become an out and out super premium for us?
Yeah, look, it's a super important point. And I guess I just want to perhaps lay out some context as to why I think LDU in particular this year is super relevant. So it's already well established that to do well, particularly in AF and arguably in all the other formats as well, really it comes down to in your starting side, every single position, try and find a guy that's going to outperform what you're paying for them. We already know that. Well established to do well in AF, that's what you need to do. But let me put this stat to you. In the past 2 years, the top 6 fantasy mids in each year in AF, how many of those players, so from 2021 and 2022, the top 6 fantasy mids in each of those years, how many of those 12 do you think improved on their average, even if it was only by 1 point per game? How many of those 12 do you think improved on their average the subsequent year? I'll tell you the answer. The answer is 1. And that was Oliver last year when he went from 113 in 2021 to 115. Brayshaw went close last year, having done 113 the previous year to 110 last year. But the super alarming thing, MJ, is that all the other mids didn't just dip, they fell dramatically. And I think this is kind of the key point where I feel as a fantasy community, we massively underestimate how much things change, particularly at the top end, in particular in the midfield, how much changes from year to year. And at this time of year, when we're putting our sort of starting teams together, we often have this crutch of using the previous season's scores as some sort of As I said, a crutch in terms of I want a captain option, so let me put in a Dawson because he averaged 115, whatever it was last year, and he's going to do it again, and I want a good captain option. Whereas as I've just highlighted, history shows he's probably not going to be the same player that he was last year in terms of fantasy. I don't know the reason for that. I don't know how that's going to come to be, but history shows that top end changes a lot. So one, if we agree that in order to do well in AF, you need to find value with each and every one of your picks. Two, if you accept this idea that the top end, particularly in the midfield, changes significantly from year to year, then instead of going hunting in that 110 plus range, what we really need to be doing is going and finding guys that are priced, let's call it between 80 to 100, and those that are going to take that next step up. Last year, we had this plethora of young gun midfielders that were on the verge of breaking out. Your Rosies, your Butters, your Sarongs, your Tom Greens, your Gouldens. This year, looking through the list, we are not really blessed with a huge number of prime breakout candidates. I'm not saying that there are not going to be players or several players that are going to break out from that price range, but there are not a heap that we feel are primed to do that. I think LDU, he's obviously at a higher price than what some of those other guys were last year, but he's one of the perhaps few that I have in my mind that he's priced at 97 at the moment that I feel is going to potentially, or it's going to be one of the prime candidates to take that next step up. The question is that to 105? Is that to 110 or perhaps even more? We'll wait to see that. But this is the reason why I think he's so relevant. It's because we don't want to be going and shopping in that 110, 115 plus range. We want to be finding guys that can take that next step up and be next year's superstars, not last year's superstars. And again, I think LDU is a prime candidate.
He's right in that spot. And the beautiful thing for us, Vams, is the worst case scenario you feel like it's going to be for him, should he get some health and fitness, which again, outside of last year, the 2 years prior would have given you a little bit of confidence. You're paying for what he is in AF and DT, which is a high 90s average guy, and that's certainly not going to derail your season. While in SuperCoach, he's already at that space that you talk about being one of the top 10 sort of midfield territory, while he's priced at the 11th best mid. We've seen over stretches, he can go big 120, 130, 140 plus scores. So I think some of that illustration that you've unpacked for us in AF is obviously easily paralleled to DT, but equally as valuable and relevant for us in SuperCoach. There's a couple of things I want to steal your brain on. I think there's a couple of concerns people might have. I feel like one can get squashed pretty quickly. The other needs a conversation. But before I get there, he's priced in this interesting range where, depending on the format you play, you've got guys like a Touk Miller, who we haven't seen in the 50 most relevant yet. I wonder if he'll appear. You've got a Jack Steele, who again, will he appear in the 50 most relevant? We'll wait and see. You could argue that just using those two as an example have got greater legacy of history, depending on the format you play in, are comparably priced, but might have a few more question marks around them, maybe not so much in durability, which we will talk about with LDU, but more so in terms of game style, coaching structures, and bodies coming into that midfield mix. How important is it for you to put those factors in consideration of potential question marks, concerns on other players, as it is to considering a player like an LDU? How do you go about building those elements all together?
I think, understandably, there's this big bias towards favoring players that, inverted commas, we've seen do it before. And so you mentioned Touk Miller. A few years ago, he went at 120, was one of them. May have even been the highest averaging player that year, along with perhaps it was Jack Steele. And perhaps he's another good example in that same range where they're priced somewhat similarly. We've seen them go very, very large before. And again, we have this bias towards favoring those types because we've seen it before. We know they can do it. I would question, and I don't have any objective data to back this up, I would question how many of those guys genuinely do come back to match that sort of outlier average that they've done once before, especially when it was 2-3 years ago. You take Touk Miller, for instance. the midfield he was in a couple of years ago is very different to the one he's in now. Like, you could argue now this is either, Raul's team, Noah Anderson's team. What role is he going to play in, in the new coach's game plan? We've talked about, obviously previous Dimmer's game style at Richmond. It's never really been super conducive to very, very high fantasy scores, although you could also then make an argument about how many players has he had similar to this. So you've really got to try and compare apples to apples there. But I don't think it's a given that someone like Touk Miller just goes back to 110 or Jack Steele goes back to 110. Like, coaches change, midfield mixes change. And I think we can get into a sort of caught in this very dangerous trap of so-and-so did it 2-3 years ago and they're now healthy, so they'll just get back to that, right? And again, my gut feeling is that more often than not, that does not happen. And so I think it's actually perhaps easier to try and find the guy that can perhaps take the step up to that level, just due to natural progression. You mentioned LDU with regards to his body and these sorts of things. So we do have a couple of very plausible reasons as to why he might make that step up to 105 and 110. And that is, just needs to stay on the park, which granted, he's had a lot of trouble doing previously. But again, if he can just stay on the park and put together a good 20 games, in a row without having this interrupted, because you look at last year, he had this 5-game patchy stretch, relatively early in the season. You'll recall super well. He, from memory, he sort of tummed up twice in a row in the first 2 games. Everyone was like, okay, this is that sort of uber premium that we all need to jump on. A lot of people traded into him going into round 3. And then what happened? That late out. And if you weren't on Twitter, rolling lockout, we can talk about sort of the pros and cons of that. But if you weren't on Twitter, you took you took either a donut or copped an emergency score that week, which is a bit of a disaster. And then subsequent to that, he had this sort of patchy, let's call it next, 10 rounds where he played 3 games and then missed another game, played 2 games and missed the last quarter, in Port Adelaide when he injured his hammy, and then he missed the next 5 games. And so again, and then obviously missed the last 2 games of the season as well. So it's just patchiness. And I think these days, and perhaps probably always in AFL, like, you need to have that sustained fitness. You need to have your body cherry ripe. If you're going to be averaging 110, you're not going to be doing it hobbled, coming off this injury and having this interrupted season. And I think that's the thing I'm probably most concerned about with him is, can he stay on the park? And history shows that he struggled to do that. He had a shoulder reconstruction, in his underage years when he was a 17-year-old. He had another shoulder reconstruction in 2019. In 2020, he missed chunks of games due to what they described as pubic overload. 21, 22, he played most games. We thought, that's it. He's finally getting his body right. And then again, last year, injury struck. And it's odd because there are the kind of these strange injuries. Obviously, he had that calf tightness in round 3. He then, in round 6, he missed a game with a heel injury. I'm not entirely sure what that is. And then obviously in round 9, he got that hamstring injury. But constant sort of niggles. And I don't know if that's just bad luck or, look, everyone's built differently. And some people perhaps are just a little bit more brittle than others. We can't really, we don't really know at this stage. But if we go by his injury history, that's going to be the big thing that we need to be careful of, I guess. And in my opinion, the biggest risk with his with selecting him in his starting side.
I think so too. I don't see anywhere from a role within the team that you can have cause for concern. A few days ago, there was the episode we did on Jai Simpkin with Louis, and we unpacked this midfield of North Melbourne. He's the lead dog in a struggling side, and historically, those teams aren't tagged by the vast majority of the competition. And again, even if that comes his way, while there is some fluctuation in his basement, he's shown, as you unpacked right at the top of the episode, Vams, he's got that outside game as well to get onto the uncontested, and he's got the inside game to not just win the ball, but do the defensive stuff and tackle. So I'm not concerned about the tags. I'm not concerned about the role. The issue you've nailed on the head beautifully is around how many games will he play? If he gets continuity in his body, he's basically a top 10 mid already for us in SuperCoach. That should only through natural progression of continuity in your body have him safely established in that. While for AFL Fantasy, he just needs some injury luck. If you believe he's going to get it, he should be an absolute serious consideration for your starting squad, and has shown over 3 years he can elevate scoring beyond that 115, 120, 130 mark, and can be a vice captaincy consideration for you, which is super important. If the injury history turns you off, that's absolutely okay. Don't pick him. That's fine. My only little flag for you is this, is if you choose not to select him because of injury history in your starting squad, history would say the more games you play, the greater the injury risk goes and the variable increases based on history. Now, it means he can play an uninterrupted season. Brad Crouch, Taylor Adams, the list goes on of guys with really rubbish injury history getting through it for a season. So there's no reason it'll happen. However, my little kind of flag of warning for you, if you go, nah, don't want him, he's injury prone. What happens when he does what he did in 2023? Big tons to start the year. Round 3, you're like, I'm trading into him. You're just opening yourself up for the risk. So I'm much more of the believer of, if they've got an injury history, start with them, bank the points. Don't get surprised if the injury comes, but hopefully you jag some premium scores rather than, oh no, his value. Oh no, he's great. It just feels like you're doubling down on the pain that could come your way. And it's now costing you 2 trades, one to get him in, one to get him out. I'd rather just spend the 1 trade on starting, copping it if it hits, and then just pivot to the other guy. Because I guess the beauty of him, Vams, is there are a bunch of guys in DT, in AF and SuperCoach priced right alongside him that might not be as good as he could be, but geez, there's so many good options in this range for us to consider.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. And just to put his injury history into perspective, he was actually drafted the same year as Andy Brayshaw. I think Andy was taken a couple of picks ahead of him. Again, to put into perspective how much football Luke has missed, Brayshaw has played 123 games. Luke has played 85 games. That's essentially 2 seasons more of AFL football that Andy Brayshaw has played versus LDU, right? Now, as I said, LDU's played 85 games. What did Brayshaw average after his first 76 games? That season, he averaged 104, which is actually very similar to what LDU did last year when you remove a couple of his injury-affected games. Now, what did Brayshaw do the following year? He had that monster premium season where he went on to average 113. So I guess my point is, if we're sort of putting the rose-colored glasses on and saying, look, what could LDU... You could argue on a per game basis, he's tracking along somewhat similar to what Brayshaw did, right? After 85 games, he's averaging pretty similar to what Brayshaw did after a similar amount of games. The question is, can he take that step up? I think all the metrics of what his fantasy game involves, all the role, the position that he's in, suggests that he can. And I'm banking on him going 105, 110 plus next year. I think it's going to happen. I don't think he's got it in him to sort of go 115 plus, but I think going to that uber premium status is absolutely possible. And you highlighted the role that he's in as well. I completely agree. I think a very good heuristic to guys that potentially score very well in, at least in AF, is these big dog mids that have a relatively thin midfield around them that play for a poor team, right? And he fits that beautifully. Yes, North Melbourne have a lot of guys that can go through there, but we're just listing names, right? You're talking about Wardlaw, who I think is probably going to be another mainstay, but he's in his 2nd year. Simpkin, what role is he going to play? Is he going to be inside mid? Is he going to be sort of a high half forward? You got Sheezel, we're still not sure there. Taron Thomas, still not a full-time mid. Yeah, obviously they've got the rookie coming through, McKercher. Greenwood, is he best 22? I don't know. Again, I'm just listing guys, but
yeah,
he's clearly the big dog there, right?
correct.
And these big dog mids that can lay a tackle in particular. So you compare him to, say, Laird a couple of years ago. You compare him to both Steele, although he didn't play for a very poor team that year, but it wasn't a great team. Certainly Took played for a very poor team that year that he went 120. They all have that same thing in common. Prime midfielder that can lay a tackle, that can get you those 7, 8, 9, 10 tackles, but a thin midfield around them. So they're the main dog. They're the ones that demand the ball each and every time. And he fits that beautifully. And so I love his game. I love his role. It's just, can he stay fit? That's all. That's all we want to see. Can he stay fit?
That's really the only concern. He's heading to 110 in my eyes in AF and DT and destined for 120 in SuperCoach. It's all about, does he stay healthy and fit? If he does, lock this guy away. If you're happy to run the risk of it, lock this guy away in your starting squad. If you're a bit risk averse, okay, now you're starting to look for some other options. Vams, before we wrap up the episode, want to get your take on where he goes on draft day. Like I said, he's ranked in just outside the top 10 mids in SuperCoach based off 2023 data. And he's in the, I think, 27, 28 marker of mids in AF and DT. Last year, it was the year of the forwards, super heavy forward. This year, it does feel like maybe if you want one of the top few, you've got to go early. There's a plethora of rucks to pick. Again, if you want one of those top guys, you've got to go early. So it does feel like people structurally might lean heavy mids early. Where do you see him going in a draft format this year?
I think generally in drafts, people almost universally draft off prior season average and how, like, so other than the sleepers that perhaps all you need is one switched on coach that takes a guy a round or two earlier than perhaps they that you thought you were. Generally, in terms of these types of guys or the top end mids, they almost always roughly go how they went sort of last year. So my guess is that that's where LDU will go. So you'll probably see those 110 mids, go early. You'll see the big rucks go early. You'll see, I think, 2 or 3 of the forwards might go early, given how thin the position is. I think you'll see, due to positional scarcity, you'll see some people perhaps go quite early on forwards in drafts this year. Again, you'll have a couple of defenders that go early, those 100-point per game defenders. And that's when I think after that is when you're going to start to see LDU start to get taken. So, let's call it in that 30, 35-ish range. And I think if in your AF scoring leagues, if you can get him as your M2, I think you're going to do fine. I think if he's your M3, like, you're going to be sitting in a really good spot. SuperCoach a little bit different, as you've alluded to this episode, that his scoring is already almost at that super premium sort of level anyway. But I'd be targeting him in that in that third round, and in that late third round, perhaps early fourth round. And I think if you can get him there as your M2, M3 in sort of AF scoring, I think you're going to be sitting pretty.
Yeah, I think so. An M3 and AF probably means you've heavily attacked that midfield and maybe not chosen to go with a ruck early on or one of those top-end defender or forwards, and that's still perfectly fine. While SuperCoach, I think he's going M2, and that could be as early as a late second round selection to mid second round selection. I think he will be popular in the sort of third, with people really wanting to lock away the English, the Marshall, the Gawn, the Dacos, all these kind of guys. But regardless, it's going to be fascinating to me to see where and how he goes on draft day. Vams, what a debut from you, mate. Absolute special work being able to hear and see your wisdom being shared on this episode as we talked about LDU. We look forward to having you back on again, not just for another episode of the 50 Most Relevant, but the next couple of weeks, a special podcast with yourself and Rids on the way, specifically dedicated to AF strategy. You want to give people just a quick insight to what we might hear on that episode?
I think the main thing Rids and I just want to have a chat about and see if anyone else is interested in it is just what we learnt from playing the game last year. I think, again, there's this common understanding about value and all of this, but I think there are some other sort of perhaps some subtle nuances to the game that, certainly I didn't appreciate coming back into playing sort of salary cap format after playing leagues for a very long time. So we just want to unpack some of the things that we learnt from playing the game last year and perhaps what we can take into this year's game.
I know our AFL fantasy listeners are going to love that. And there are definitely some parallels for dream teamers and super coaches, although the games have a lot of nuances and differences. I still think there's going to be some wisdom. So you make sure you check that out. Vams, it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure chatting to you on this episode. If you want to go and listen to any of the other episodes with any of the other Coaches Panel members, you can go and check that out. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, you can go and find that. There's an article that accompanies not just this episode, but every other episode. You can check that out at coachespanel.tv. In under 60 seconds, I got a quick clue about who is coming up for you next at number 40 and the 50 most relevant. But if you are enjoying what you're getting from the Coaches Panel this pre-season, a couple of things I'd encourage you to do. One, make sure you follow and subscribe across all the social media channels that you are on. Chances are the Coaches Panel is right there. If you are loving the podcast, make sure you give it a 5-star rating and review. It helps others in the community get to know and see about the Coaches Panel. And lastly, if you're willing and able, you can jump onto our Patreon supporter group for just a few dollars a month. There's a couple of different tiers. One of them, I'm sure, is right for you. It's a great way to support the Coaches Panel. You get access to a bunch of exclusive groups, some hidden content, access to different members of the panel. And if you jump in at the breakout or premium tier, you get the podcast a day early. So Patreons are like, I knew LDU yesterday. They already know what my clues are for number 40. So if you want to do that, all the details for our Patreon and also our social media, you're going to find in the description of this episode. So tomorrow, we're about to depart the 40s. Number 40. Who is it? It's a guy that, if you want to talk historical pedigree, is almost unmatched across the formats in fantasy footy. He's got incredible value baked into his price point, but there's a big reason that a lot in the community are concerned. Now, what is that concern? Is he coming back from an injury? Has he got an early bye? Has something drastically changed in his team around him? Or could it be all three? Or is it none of them? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.